Hello class, welcome to Physiology 5116, Clinical Physiology 2. We start the semester with pulmonary physiology, and these are some topics that we'll be covering in our first class. The diffusion barrier function of the pulmonary system, ventilation, mechanics, which is basically how you get air in and out of your lungs, compliance and airway resistance, and finally work of breathing. So we'll start with some learning objectives about the diffusion barrier. We're basically going to talk about the basic structure function of the pulmonary system and talk about the adaptations of the pulmonary system that promote diffusion. The lungs are a wonderful product of evolution in mammals, and just tremendous surface area, very thin barrier for wonderful diffusion. The pulmonary system does some defense, and we have to think about some of the structures in the epithelium that allow particles to be swept out of the lungs, and we also want to talk about the structures that are part of the diffusion distance from the alveoli to the blood. So here is pulmonary woman, and so we have a nasal cavity and we have an oral cavity, and those meet in the back to form the pharynx. So we have the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. Then we go through the larynx and into the trachea. We have many airways, splitting many times, about 23 times, and then those terminate on little sacs called alveoli that make up the lung tissue. We also have the rib cage and the diaphragm that form the chest wall. So the lung tissue and the chest wall are in very close proximity, and that's important to the function of the pulmonary system. That's where we start. I point this out, the importance, because the mouth and the nose and the pharynx and the larynx and the trachea and the large airways, those make up something we call dead space. And then out in the alveoli is actually where gas exchange occurs. So why do we have a system that branches so much, that branches about 23 times, so that we have 8 times 10 to the 6th little alveolar sacs? Well, it gets us a tremendous amount of surface area. So like frog lungs are just big bags of air, and the surface area is just on the outside. But mammalian lungs are lots of little tiny sacs, and you add those up, we have about 300 million of those little sacs in human lungs, and it ends up being quite a vast surface area. I also want you to note that as the airways branch, the total cross-sectional area is going to get larger and larger. So if we think about what we've learned about total cross-sectional area and flow velocity, think about what happens to the velocity of the blood as it moves into the arterioles and the capillaries. Well, it slows down, right? Well, that's what happens to the air velocity in the airways. The air velocity slows down. Now, what could be a health consequence? Well, air may contain particles, and the airflow might be so slow that the particles are no longer suspended in the air, and they are going to settle out in the small airways. And so in our society, we have a big argument about environmental regulations interfering with economic development, and the need for environmental regulations to protect health. And the physiology here shows where that conflict occurs. So here's a picture showing us all these little alveoli. So you add these all up together and you get a very vast surface area. Some people talk about half of a tennis court of alveolar epithelium in your lungs. Notice that we have a artery branching in, lots and lots of arterioles, and a very dense capillary network occurring in the alveoli, and then blood being taken away by a venous system. So there's as much branching in the blood system as there is in the arterial system. Notice that we have some smooth muscle regulating the size of airways, and we're down to a point where we have lost the cartilage. You see a little bit of the cartilage at this part of the picture. So there's a huge interface of the alveolar epithelium and the blood supply, and it has been estimated that 80% of the alveolar surface is in communication with capillary blood. So if you drill down even deeper and look at these alveoli, you see a couple of things here. You see these very flat cells, and here's an even larger diagram. These very flat cells, these are type 1 epithelial cells, and they make up most of the structure of the alveoli. If you were to sort of take some lung tissue and chop it all up, these would be the most abundant cell. They form what's called the diffusion barrier. So we have a large surface area and we have a very thin diffusion barrier. So these are two very important adaptations in mammalian lungs to promote diffusion. So if you have more surface area, you have a bigger diffusion flux. If you have a shorter distance, you have a bigger diffusion flux. If you have a larger concentration gradient, you have a bigger diffusion flux. And the structure here maximizes this process. Notice we also have some little cells that are called type 2 cells. These cells make a substance called surfactant, and I can't always write really well with this. Surfactant. It's a phospholipid that helps lower surface tension, and we'll get to that in a subsequent slide. So it's kind of interesting when you look at this diagram. It looks like your lungs are mostly air, and they are. But then we have this wonderful, wonderful epithelium. So you see these little flat cells where diffusion occurs. Here's a capillary, so where the air exchange occurs. We have some of our type 2 cells here making the surfactant. And if you look farther along in the airways, you move up along this epithelium, and then you start to see little hair cells. So those are cilia that they don't always go all the way down. You see they're a little bit sparse here. They're a little more dense as we go up in the airways. These are surrounded by mucus cells, and they help sweep out substances that get stuck in your lungs. Now when we talk about respiration, we often mean the process of respiration is getting air in and out of your lungs. But another part of respiration is what happens at the cell, which is oxidative phosphorylation to make ATP. And we shouldn't get too far away from the idea that that's really what your lungs are about. So you are ventilating, you're bringing air from the outside into the alveoli. That happens by a process by bulk flow that's very fast, just as blood flows very quickly through the blood system by bulk flow. We get down to the capillaries and down to the very teeny tiny airways in the alveoli, and air moves by diffusion so that we preserve the gradients so that oxygen can diffuse into the venous blood and oxygenate it, and CO2 can be removed from the venous blood. Then that blood flow is circulated to the left heart, to the tissues where we have an exchange at the tissue level, and respiration, the oxygen has to get into the mitochondria, and we need 3 millimeters of mercury of partial pressure of oxygen in order to power that cellular respiration. Then that venous blood, right heart, and back to the lungs to become oxygenated again. So your lungs do a number of things. They provide oxygen through ventilation. They help us to excrete carbon dioxide. This is an important point because when CO2 is added to body tissues, it increases the hydrogen ion concentration, and we'll talk about that in subsequent slides. Therefore, the lungs has a role in pH regulation, working with the kidneys. Humans are kind of cool because we can talk. So we're also using our respiratory system to make sounds. Because we are upright and we use our respiratory system to talk, that makes us vulnerable to foreign body obstruction, so we are more likely to choke than other animals. But evidently, in terms of evolution, it was worth the trade-off. Our respiratory system defends against microbes. We have something called the mucociliary escalator that sweeps particles out of the lungs trapped on mucus, and we also have some lymph nodes in the pulmonary system, and we have lymphocytes that are capable of producing a kind of immunoglobulin called IgA to help defend against invaders. Our lungs make and break down all sorts of things. They make heparin, make bradykinins, can also break down bradykinins, make prostacyclins and prostaglandins. There's an important enzyme in the pulmonary system called ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme, that allows us to produce angiotensin II. And the pulmonary system is a filter. So when blood clots form, maybe from the leg, they get trapped in the lungs so they can be taken apart and removed. This is happening in everyone, and it's perfectly fine if it happens on a small scale. If a very, very large number of clots happen, or if a very large clot is produced and blocks off pulmonary flow, that's called a pulmonary embolism and is quite dangerous, and we will talk about that in another lecture. So I'm going to end it here. We've talked about the structure function of the pulmonary system, particularly in regards to the barrier function, the diffusion layer of the lungs, and in our next presentation we will go on to ventilation.